Today we continue our series on military strategy and our salute to the military leaders and the strategy thinking that they have developed. And we continue that with the book called Guerrilla Warfare by Che Guevara, Ernesto Che Guevara. It's a very thin book, by the way. Conceptually, this is a little bit of a different book than the books we covered in episode 7. By the way, if you missed that one, please have a look, because we're going to sort of build on that episode. So this is a little bit between military strategy and grand strategy. And the reason I say that is because the book talks about a little bit of a playbook approach to guerrilla warfare. So it has all these practical tips on how to survive such a warfare. But at the same time, when you are in a revolution, you have a journey. And either you complete the journey or you pretty much die. So basically, you can't just say that, hey, I'm going to react to the situation. You have certain stages, and you have to pass those stages. And the end stage is that you have sort of eliminated the dictatorship or whatever government you are replacing, and you have completed your revolution. So from that point of view, it has a little bit elements of multiple fights and the journey that the grand strategy talks about. But at the same time, it also connects to military strategy. But maybe, Peter, let's talk a little bit about Ernesto and his background. How did he end up becoming this authority of guerrilla warfare?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting. He's actually an Argentinian doctor, and he was radicalized during his motorcycle trips around Southern America, or so they say. And yeah, he was greatly involved in the radicalization movement and then the revolution of Cuba, and was kind of this strategic and tactical warfare mastermind behind the guerrillas' tactics. And later on, when, as you know, they become successful, he then sought out to spread the word in, for example, into Africa, and then also in other parts of Latin America. And actually, his story ends there. He was unsuccessful in Latin America and was killed there. But he left as a legacy this kind of very interesting thoughts and this kind of radicalization icon, which I think is highly interesting.
I guess you're a little bit painting this political perspective here. I wouldn't say radicalization necessarily. I mean, he had a certain view on society during his motorcycle trip around Latin America. He was from a wealthy family, by the way. The Guevaras were quite wealthy in Argentina, so he had that kind of background. But given he was interested in medical, and he also felt bad for the poor people and the income inequalities that they had in Latin America. So he was always a little bit of a socialist by nature, and sort of his doctoral background also shows then in Cuba, who had a very good health system, which they then sort of exported also to other revolutionary places and so on. But an interesting guy, he had his own worldview. I think we will start the comparison by taking that issue tree we discussed already in the previous episode and a little bit compare how that should be adjusted when we talk about guerrilla warfare compared to regular military strategy where a government is facing another government. So first of all, when you are dealing with a revolution, you're obviously replacing the sovereign interest that is there right now. So from that point of view, as I said, this is a little bit of a black and white journey. You either complete your revolution, or typically, if you don't, you end up dead. So from that point of view, the path here from the beginning is committed to, and there are certain success gates, and you have to pass them. Whereas in the previous issue tree, we talked a little bit about that sovereign interest can change, and the direction of the journey can change. And the other thing is that the use of force is a given. At least in Che Guevara's time, revolution was always taken from the communistic view that, okay, we have to do it by force. And in particular here then, they talk about both direct and indirect engagement. So indirect being then sabotage and others. And these are used in parallel. So there's no discussion about can we even avoid the use of force. We are trying to avoid the use of force when it wastes our resources, but we are definitely using force in other situations. And then finally, that comes back to the point that the revolution starts from something small. So the story really talks a lot about converting enemy resources. So starting from small resources against a big enemy, your strategy has to be built on converting other people's resources to yours. So typically the government's resources to your force.
Yeah. And I think also there are other important elements that receive attention here. Mainly two comes to my mind now. First is that one needs to have a complete knowledge of the terrain you're operating in. So if you're in an unfamiliar terrain, this strategy won't fit you. You need to have the complete knowledge and leverage that knowledge into your advantage. And it needs to be on a strategic level, but then it needs to also be on a tactical, like very granular level. And I think then the second point here is that the moral standing of the commanders and troops is very important to this strategy. And there needs to be this kind of collective thinking and ethics behind the group, and also kind of basically set of rules in how do you operate in certain situations. So in a way, actually, this also in a lower tactical level, this is partly a rules-based strategy, in my opinion, as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, sometimes we talk to corporate clients and also single business units, SMEs, and we talk to their management. And you can sometimes see that management is not fully aligned behind the strategy. And you can also see that their values and their principles and the culture is not fully aligned. And of course, when that happens in a business context, it actually takes away the strength from the strategy. And Che Guevara talks a lot about making sure that the people who are in the revolution and who are brought into the central group, by the way, he was the only non-Cuban in the very top level of Fidel Castro's organization. So that also says something about his sort of commitment to the cause. But when you have a revolution, obviously you have to worry about spies and things like that as well. But since these guys really live and die by the success of their collaboration, the focus on executing the strategy is much, much higher. So you could think of this as a business where the management team cannot leave the company for another job, but you are actually stuck with the strategy you have. And you can imagine that if you were in that situation, you probably would make sure in a pretty direct way that you and your colleagues are performing and they're sharing the same values and the same commitment to the thing. So that's an interesting aspect of this. Now, I already mentioned about the resource conservation, and Che Guevara talks a lot about not wasting a single bullet. So guerrilla warfare means not shooting in vain. You actually always make sure that you use every bullet very precisely. And the other thing is also that you plan your engagement so that when you are able to hit the enemy, you at the same time are able to convert their resources to yours. And I think this you see in startup world as well, in business. You think about Tesla, for example. When Tesla made announcements, typically the traditional car makers would counteract that announcement, and that would create even more hoopla or media attention around the topic. So I think Tesla, for example, leverages a little bit this kind of thinking that you use the enemy's reaction to gain power for yourself.
Yeah, definitely. There's using the kind of your small efforts in creating as large impact as you can with those efforts. And I think that is also seen as investments. If you would think as a corporate situation, this would be CapEx investment directly. Right. But for Che and for this approach, it was actually investments into shoe factories. And what Che really stated, becoming a paramount thing, is that the warfare needs a lot of shoes. And therefore, the prior investments, the first investments, need to be on shoe factories, because that basically makes or breaks the entire war. So I think that's also a very good lesson to learn, that if you have a small budget, then you must allocate the resources into things that actually make or break the whole thing.
Right, so I think the attention to back office, a lot of corporations, when we do strategy with them, and the discussion is always external. What we will do, what markets will we conquer, how do we deal with the customer? But in fact, sometimes enough thinking is not made on, do we have the right tools, processes, and things that support our troops in the mission that they have? And this could be in R&D, this could be in production, this could be in sales and marketing, and so on. So Che, in his book, talks a lot about the supporting resources and their importance. All right, so then startups often live by the initial market that they are able to create and the support they get from that, so the early adopters. And this is, of course, similar to revolution. A revolution cannot carry on with just the core group that is involved in the engagement. They need popular support from the crowds. And but he also mentions, interestingly enough, that while peasant support was very important for the Cuban Revolution, you couldn't trust it fully, because you have to remember that the peasants were under huge pressure from the government and police force and all these kind of things. So they could also be sort of untrustworthy and cause damage to the revolution. And I think this is a lesson that startups should remember as well, that even though you have an initial early adopter group of customers, keep in mind that they really aren't yours. They're fickle, so they may very easily switch to another startup or go to mainstream. So I think there's a little bit of parallel right there. However, let's then sort of summarize our personal views. Pyry, what do you think was the biggest insights for you personally from this book?
I think the biggest insight was actually quite fundamental and related to this kind of David versus Goliath setup, and using the strength you have and guiding it to places where it causes the most impact. And that story in a basically non-biblical context for me was the main insight of this book.
Yeah, to me, I think what really struck me was how much performance evaluation, performance management, culture, values, and joint mindset in the leadership, and also joint behavior, living up to that, and the leaders being examples for the other troops, really behaving to the highest ethical standards when it came to the execution. And of course, ethical standards can be defined in many ways, but clearly in a guerrilla force, there is sort of some kind of rules and ethics that are followed. And not taking away the fact that it's very brutal, of course, warfare always is. So I think that's sort of something that it struck me, that it seems to me that we are not always spending, and even in Reddal, we're not always spending enough time on culture and processes and making sure that the humans who are executing the strategy and talking about it have the common mindset. But I think that's it. Interesting book. There are many versions of this. This particular version, I think we can say it's okay, but it's lacking some of the illustrations and pictures, so you may want to look at another version as well. But I hope you find this interesting.
Yeah, all right. So stay sharp, stay critical, and when doing strategy, remember Shay's guerrilla tactics sometimes.
All right.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.